The year is 1720. Isaac Newton, the man who discovered gravity, invented calculus, and decoded the movements of the cosmos, is standing in his London study, staring at papers that represent his financial ruin. The greatest scientific mind of his generation had just lost the equivalent of $20 million in today's money. His alleged response: "I can calculate the motions of the heavenly bodies, but not the madness of people." But here is what makes this story truly fascinating. Newton saw it coming. He sold early. He made a massive profit. And then he jumped right back in at the absolute worst possible moment. This is the story of how even genius can't save you from groupthink, FOMO, and one of history's most legendary financial bubbles. To understand Newton's catastrophic mistake, we need to go back to 1711, when the South Sea Company was born. Picture post-war Britain. The War of Spanish Succession had just ended, leaving the government drowning in debt, mostly unpaid bills to military contractors. The solution was to create the South Sea Company, a financial vehicle that would convert this messy short-term debt into long-term bonds. Here is how it worked. If you held government IOUs, you could exchange them for South Sea stock. You'd get the same interest payments, but now your investment was tradable liquid. And as a sweetener, the company got a monopoly on British trade with South America's west coast. The prospect of riches from exotic trade with the South Seas made it sound far more exciting than it actually was. In reality, the South Sea Company was basically just a middleman passing government payments to investors. Its actual trading operations, mostly dealing in enslaved people and British goods, almost certainly lost money. But that didn't matter to investors. What mattered were the dreams. By the late 1710s, the South Sea Company was respectable, even boring. It had the largest market capitalization of any joint stock company in the world. Newton, already wealthy from his position as Master of the Royal Mint, was an early investor. And why not? Interest rates were dropping, peacetime prosperity was growing, and his investment was doing nicely. Then came 1720, what would become known as the fatal year. Before we dive into the disaster, let's talk about just how wealthy Newton was. In 1720, Newton was almost 80 years old. His groundbreaking scientific work was decades behind him. He wasn't doing original research anymore. But he was still active, still president of the Royal Society, still the celebrity that every foreign dignitary wanted to meet. More importantly, he was loaded. As Master of the Mint, Newton earned about £2,000 per year, 20 times what his Cambridge professorship had paid. Add in over £1,000 per year in investment dividends, and his total annual income topped £3,000. In modern terms, that's roughly $3 million a year. He owned a horse-drawn coach, had servants, lived in one of the finest parts of London. His net worth, about £3,000, or 30 million today. He was in the top 1% of Britain, approaching the top 0.1%. But here's what's interesting: unlike most wealthy Britons of his time, Newton didn't own land. Land was the traditional marker of wealth and power. Newton was different. A pioneer in putting his money into the new financial instruments of the era: government bonds, Bank of England stock, and yes, South Sea Company shares. He understood finance. His job literally required him to make decisions based on market prices and economic conditions. He'd even written influential reports on currency policy that shaped British monetary decisions. In other words, Newton wasn't some naive scientist dabbling in investments he didn't understand. He was financially sophisticated, which makes what happens next even more remarkable. In January 1720, the South Sea Company proposed something audacious. They would take over almost the entire British national debt. This sparked a frenzy. As the legislation moved through Parliament in early 1720, South Sea stock began to rise. But the real madness started in April. On April 9th, an anonymous article appeared in the Flying Post newspaper, almost certainly planted by South Sea Company insiders. Its argument was seductive. The higher the price at which South Sea sold its new shares, the better existing shareholders would do. Here's the logic. Say you own 500 shares of a company worth $100,000 total. Each share is worth $200. If the company sells 2,000 new shares at $400 each, your company now has $900,000 in assets and 2,500 shares. Your original shares are now worth $360 each. Sell those new shares at $600 instead and your shares jump to $520 each. It sounds mathematical, it sounds smart, but it's complete nonsense. This logic only works if there's some reason the new investors are paying more, like a startup that's just made a technological breakthrough. The Flying Post article offered no such justification. It was describing an 18th century Ponzi scheme dressed up in mathematical clothing. 3 rebuttals were quickly published, including one by Archibald Hutchison, the era's most famous financial skeptic. The rebuttals clearly explained the fallacy. But here's the thing about bubbles: logic doesn't matter when everyone around you is getting rich. As one prominent banker wrote in June 1728, "When the rest of the world is mad, we must imitate them in some measure." Now we get to Newton's moment of clarity. On April 19th, Newton issued an order to sell 30 shares of South Sea stock. 4 days later, on April 23rd, he sold another 70 shares. Between these 2 dates was a South Sea Company shareholder meeting on April 21st. We don't know exactly what was discussed, but Newton apparently saw through the hype. Maybe the rebuttals of the Flying Post article influenced him. Maybe the shareholder meeting itself raised red flags. Maybe his scientific mind simply recognized the mathematical impossibility of the promises being made. Whatever the reason, Newton got out. By this point, he'd liquidated essentially his entire South Sea position. His profit, approximately £7,000, equivalent to $7 million today. He took that money and bought government bonds instead, the safe, boring investment he'd started with. Newton had beaten the bubble. He was one of the contrarian few who saw the mania for what it was and escaped with his gains. The story should end here, with Newton as the genius who outsmarted the crowd. But it doesn't. Through May and into June, something tortuous happened. The South Sea stock price kept climbing, and climbing, and climbing. Newton watched from the sidelines as his friends, his colleagues, his fellow investors grew wealthier by the day. The Hall estate, where Newton served as executor, began buying South Sea stock in early May. Everyone was making money, everyone except the genius who'd sold in April. By June, Newton cracked. The psychological term for it is fear of missing out. But it went deeper than that. It was groupthink, the overwhelming pressure of seeing your entire society convinced of something you've rejected. As the Flying Post article gained believers, as the stock price validated their faith, doubt crept in. Maybe they knew something he didn't. In mid-June, Newton began liquidating his government bonds, almost all of them. He poured essentially his entire fortune into South Sea stock, buying at prices near the absolute peak. Then he kept buying. As the stock price began to slide in late summer, Newton continued investing. 3 more documented purchases as the price fell. The Hall estate did the same, showing real faith in the South Sea project, even as it collapsed. By September, the bubble burst completely. The precipitous collapse had begun. By October, South Sea stock was worth less than a quarter of its peak price. Newton's net worth had plummeted from over £50,000, what he would have had if he'd simply kept his April profits, down to about £20,000 by mid-1721. He'd lost his £7,000 profit. Then he'd lost another £10,000 on top of that. Total losses £17,000, or about $17 million today. Some accounts claim he lost $20,000, and that's entirely plausible depending on how you calculate opportunity costs. The South Sea Company didn't disappear, by the way. After financial restructuring, it continued until the mid-1800s, basically just distributing government payments. Early investors who bought before 1719 and simply held on actually did fine. They made about 50% capital gains, plus generous dividends. The bubble created a Ponzi-like effect where early investors profited at the expense of those who bought at the peak. Newton was not ruined. At his death in 1727, his estate was worth about £30,000, roughly what it had been before the bubble. But he'd lost a fortune and 7 years of compounding gains. In a letter written in 1724, Newton told a friend trying to pitch him another investment, "I lost very much by the South Sea Company, which makes my pockets empty, and my mind averse from dealing in these matters. So what's the lesson here?" Newton's story is often told as, even geniuses make mistakes, or you can't predict markets. But it's deeper than that. Newton succeeded in fields where genius mattered because he stood on the shoulders of giants. Galileo, Kepler, Descartes had laid the groundwork. In physics and mathematics, brilliance could cut through complexity to find truth. But in the South Sea bubble, he was standing in a swamp. There were no fundamentals to analyze because the South Sea Company never presented a real business plan. There was only narrative, hype, and the madness of crowds. An estimated 80 to 90% of British investors were drawn into the bubble. Newton wasn't uniquely foolish. He was typically human. The real lesson: intelligence doesn't protect you from groupthink. Expertise in one domain doesn't transfer to another. And the hardest position to hold isn't being wrong when everyone else is wrong. It's being right when everyone else is wrong, and then staying right as they get temporarily rich. Newton calculated the motion of the heavens. But when it came to the madness of people, even Newton was just another investor swept up in the crowd, reaching for dreams that mathematics should have told him were impossible.